Well, greetings and welcome to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Agricultural Profitability webinar series. I'm Brad Lubben. I'm an Ag Policy Specialist here with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in our Center for Ag Profitability. And today is one of our regular weekly webinar series focused on key issues and topics for agricultural professionals, producers, and decision makers. It's a pleasure this time to welcome Dr. Scott Brown from the University of Missouri to join us for a discussion of the ag economic outlook, both at the U.S. and Nebraska level. Scott is the interim director of the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center, and that is a multi-state or a USDA-funded center that focuses on state-level analysis and extending the work of a sister entity at Missouri, the Food and Ag Policy Research Institute, which Scott is also part of as well. So we're pleased to have Scott join us. Scott's going to talk about the U.S. outlook. I'm going to come in to talk about the Nebraska outlook specifically as part of the collaborative work that we do together. And we'll give a perspective on where we are currently with the farm income outlook and where it looks like we're headed over the next few months. So we thank you, as I said, for joining us today. We appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and share this information. As always, you can find our information on our website at cap.unl.edu, cap as in cap.unl.edu. You'll find today's webinar recording once we're done. You'll find slides available on that site once we're done as well. You'll find a schedule of all of our upcoming webinars, as well as an archived copy of previous webinars for your interest. As I said, we're going to talk about the current farm income situation outlook, recognizing that crop prices have fallen. Livestock receipts may be challenged as well in the coming years, and we have to plug all of that into maybe ongoing sticky production expenses that can challenge profitability and challenge margins. I'm going to ask Scott to comment on those issues first from a national perspective and begin our discussion. So Scott, let me welcome you by stopping this title slide here and looking to you to share your national perspective. We see your slide. We don't hear you yet. There we go.
Okay, so sorry for the little bit of delay getting set up. It's like the first time I've ever done Zoom, Brad. So I appreciate the chance to talk a little bit about where really U.S. ag markets are as we think about what this means for different state farm incomes. It's been a great opportunity for us to collaborate with the good folks at Nebraska, and Brad, thanks for the collaboration doing some of these state level farm income information. I like to remind us that what really conditions or allows us to go to the state level is the work done at FAPRI. FAPRI's been in existence for 40 years. Amazingly, 4 decades checked off the box, and they recently in March would have turned out their long-term agricultural outlook. It's a report that's done each year that really provides Congress with kind of what's the look forward when we look at all the different commodities, more from a national perspective, but we use a lot of this information when we're driving into the work that RAF's doing at the state level in particular. I at least like to start with a little bit of long-term perspective on U.S. farm income before we start looking ahead. So I sometimes will say I'm good at forecasting history, but this idea that farm income's coming off of the record 180 billion plus that we would have seen back in 2022. Number one, I always say that the increase in 2021 and 2022 is an amazing increase over that short period of time relative to history. And yes, USDA told us 2023 farm income fell, and their expectation for 2024 farm income, which is what's the dot on this particular graph, is for a further decline to about $116 billion. That is still above when you look at kind of that 2015 through 2020 average. We're still above that. I think there's still this concern of receipts coming down, expenses remaining high. How much further do we decline as we look ahead? And I think this is where the FAPRI baseline can at least give us a little bit of indication of what that group is saying in front of us. When we look at the individual components, again, just to probably really focus on the white boxes with these stacks of bars. Number one, farm receipts down 21 billion according to USDA for 2024 in their latest outlook. Expenses, total expenses up about 17 billion. And what's a net farm income falling from 156 billion to 116. So $40 billion decline. Again, I'll say it's off of some historically high levels of farm income that we're talking about these declines. When you look at some of the work we've been doing of polling economists around the country who spend their time doing ag outlook and just say, what do you see for the overall ag economy? And this has been a survey that started back in June of 2023. So you see all of the monthly survey results that we have put together over the last several months. And again, I'll keep saying the tone of the economist is for a slightly worse situation. It has continued to move generally trend lower as we've gone from survey to survey. I think that mimics much of what we see when we look at that overall farm income outlook. Maybe in some ways, this group is, again, saying slightly worse off, not that the decline from 180 plus to 116 is a much worse off situation. So just moving in a slightly worse direction, according to the survey. As I look at what FAPRI is saying for the next decade, and having spent a lot of time in FAPRI as well myself, I'll say I always know one thing with certainty about any kind of long-term forecast, and that it will be wrong when you look at the specifics of it. But I think the direction is important here to talk about. FAPRI, similar to USDA, is talking about farm income in 2024 that's slightly below $120 billion. Fairly flat then for the next few years, and that's some trade-off of expenses moving a little bit lower, crop prices, although maybe a little bit lower, not moving as much lower as we've seen the past couple of years. Cattle markets that continue to talk about higher prices for the next few years, really driving that. And it's not until you get in the latter decade of their forecast where we see this continual decline down to about $100 billion by the end. Again, I'll say that $100 billion is still above, in nominal terms, what we saw 2015 through 2020. But in real terms, we are talking about farm income below those levels that we would have seen historically. When you look at receipts, we certainly see the rise as we saw higher crop prices, higher livestock prices. That got us record receipts in 2022. We're suggesting roughly a 50 some odd billion dollar decline in those receipts for 2024. And then if you notice, again, fairly flat. So, I often describe that looking forward as a lot more sideways as we look ahead. And I should at least stop for a minute and say, there's a lot of assumptions that are conditioning assumptions, if you will, to this longer term baseline, average weather being one of them. We know there's going to be years where we have really good yields and years where we have challenging yields because of weather. On average, in what we look at here, I think that's why we see a lot of that sideways when you look at the receipt side of the equation. Now, when you look at production costs, so 2024 slightly above 2023. No real relief from what was the jump in 2022. So despite we had record farm income, we also had at the time record production expenses that they've continued to creep higher. I think it's easy for expenses to go higher when revenues are up. It's harder to get them to come down when revenues decline. FAPRI suggests 2025 some slight declines in expenses. I think interest rate discussion is important and whether or not we get this decline or not. But then production expenses that really go higher as we go through the latter stages of the baseline. The green portion of this bar, I will say one of the good things, and I think you'll see this when we get into the state numbers, is that lower feed costs are helpful to the livestock industry. And when you look at feed in particular, it does go lower as these crop prices are moving lower. When we look at the financial ranking of sectors, I think this also starts to play into how does a state look relative to other states. The economists ranked beef cattle at the top, hogs at the bottom. I think if we re-rank them today, we might move that around just a little bit, but I don't think beef cattle would come off of the number one spot as one of the best sectors. Perhaps hogs might move up a little bit as those prices have gotten better. If we start to look at the prices, and so I've indexed a number of prices here for us just to take a long-term historical view. You see 2012 where we had the drought that pushed crop prices higher, corn, soybeans, wheat, all much higher as supplies were limited. You see that then a little bit later, 2014, what were higher hog prices, higher milk prices, in particular, higher cattle prices. So we got the response once feed costs went high a year or two down the road, getting livestock production to slow enough to get higher prices. You look at 2022, and one of the few times ever we had all of those prices moving higher, all six on that chart moving higher. So I think it was both supply and strong demand that drove us higher in all these commodities. When you look at what's happening the next couple of years, again, I'll say a lot of those are sideways. It's really cattle that continues to look like it's optimistic, and that is very driven by weather and just how tight beef cow inventory has been. But it gives you a little bit of perspective about where these prices sit today relative to history. When we look at what FAPRI said in their recent baseline, number one, they're saying all these crop prices are coming back to levels that they would have seen over the 2014 through 2022 crop years. And so wheat coming off of its peak back in 2022, soybeans, corn, cotton was at a record in 2021, but a big difference relative to just a couple of years ago. When you look at crop returns, here's corn and soybean returns in particular. You see that we're coming off of what were, in the case of corn, plus $650 per acre returns in the 21 year to now what's more like $350, and those are projected to stay flat to slightly decline, but certainly saw a much larger decline in corn returns, especially for 2023, relative to what happened on the soybean side. But both returns setting roughly in that $300 to $350 per acre level when you look at that long-term baseline. I think in some cases on the crop side, we're seeing what's been yields that were below trend levels. So supplies the past couple of years that might have given us higher prices. But in the case of soybeans, demand's also been strong. Biofuel demand has driven crush growth, and the baseline expects that growth to continue over the coming decade. So biofuel demand being important. Maybe there's more demand opportunities on the soybean side than the corn side. There's a lot of questions about corn and biofuel growth in front of us that I think is important to be paying attention to as well. When you look at corn prices after, in the mid 650s in 2022, coming down below $5 for the current year that we're in, the crop we harvested last fall, FAPRI suggests a further decline. We're just getting a lot closer to predicting we'll see payments for things like PLC in front of us when you look at those average prices. Now, I for a minute want to remind everyone that although FAPRI shows this nice, and I go back to the previous slide, nice kind of smooth line in front of for corn prices in front of us, that is the average of the stochastic outcomes through the FAPRI process. If we look at a couple of just the individual lines, I just want to remind us that really good yields or bad demand, the yellow line, outcome 127 and 24, can give us very low prices. Likewise, tight yields or very strong demand can push prices back towards that $6 level. So there's a lot of volatility, and it doesn't show in the average of the results, but it's important to remind us that I think we expect volatility to continue as we look forward, and weather does matter. Just to look at the 15 top corn states, roughly 90% of production occurs in those 15 states. And I'm looking at what's the D1 or worse drought situation. So the solid black line that's flat along the bottom says 17.4% is kind of the long run average. The red line with the circles is what happened in 23. We can remember about week 22 of last year, what was beginning to become a pretty tough situation in many corn states. It got better as we got further into the year, and corn yields actually were better than many would have expected. I gave us the 2012 drought just to remind us that 2023 was not exactly like what happened in 2012. Because at the end of the day, we ended up with 177.3 bushels per acre corn yields, much stronger than I think many would have thought, just given how dry we were in that mid part of 2023. So weather's going to matter. When we look at 2024, there's a few weeks here on the left-hand side of that graph just to remind us that we're still above average, but we've been moving in the right direction in terms of better rainfall in front of us. FAPRI then says as those crop prices come down, the chances for ARC and PLC payments to rebound from what's been really low levels the last 2 years, and expected again for the 23-24 year, talking about $7 to $8 billion of payments under ARC and PLC as we look forward. I think that's a marked change from the last few years that we've been through, and really starts to highlight the safety net aspects of those ARC and PLC programs. I always like to remind us that when we think about the livestock side of the equation, so in 2021 and 2022, those green bars of changes in livestock cash receipts mask what were much higher feed costs. And it wasn't until receipts on the livestock side came down in 23 that this idea that feed costs are going to be what improves profitability in 2024. A $10 billion decline in feed costs for 24, I think is helpful. Hogs in particular. It's why when you see some of our projections for feeder cattle prices, we suggest feeder cattle prices can go higher than fed cattle prices as feed yards get the opportunity to feed corn in the 4 to 450 range instead of the 6 to 650 range in front of us. We do see kind of a similar path in what's been happening on the livestock side of the equation, with the exception of cattle. Here we've got slaughter steer prices that have gone up every year since 2020. We'll see what happens here in 2024. We've kind of fallen off a little bit in terms of that positive outlook for cattle, but I still think we're going to have higher prices at the end. Yet when you look at especially hogs and dairy, they've gone back almost to where they were long term when we look at those in particular. We look at beef production, or to begin with, the green line here. So this idea that 2023 down a little more than 4%, 2024 down another 3.5%, 2025 down 2%. We don't do that very often. We did it in 2014, we did it in 2004, and then you got to go back to 1979 to see those kind of cuts in beef production. So it's not surprising, we're talking about record prices. This projection suggests you really got to get to 2027 before we talk about any kind of real growth in beef production in front of us. On the other hand, pork and chicken in particular just continue to show modest increases. So despite what's been a tough 2023 for pork producers, as they've cut breeding inventories, productivity gains have really almost offset all of that, and the production growth continues to be positive for the next few years. Here in terms of beef cow inventory, January 1 was down 2.5%. You see the big decline from the peak that we saw back in January of 2019. Again, there's a lot of question about how quickly that returns. I will say, in my book, two things are going on here. Number one, drought. All right, so you see 2024, the black bars here. The red bars in this case are kind of that long run average, if you will. And a lot of those black bars getting back closer to that long run average. We're very early in the year. I don't want to make too much of that, but we've come through multiple years of very dry weather. Nebraska certainly sticks out in this case. Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Northern Plains earlier on. So the idea that had we not had the drought, we would have a lot more beef cows than what we currently suggest January 1 of 2024. When you look at the projections for cattle prices, Fabry's calling for both 24 fed and feeder prices to move higher. Feeder prices moving up more than fed prices, kind of staying in that 180 to 185 range for fed cattle the next couple, 3 years, while we're talking about 6 to 650 weight calves in that 280 range. I always struggle when we're at record prices to suggest that we're going to talk about higher prices, but just given how tight supplies are, I think that's certainly going to continue as we look ahead. I will say to hog producers, I think this is an opportunity where when you see feed costs that have dropped roughly $10 per hundred, that's what's helping some of them at least start to find returns that perhaps break even. Not a lot of black ink at this point, but it's certainly helpful relative to what were extremely high feed expenses they faced back in 2022 and 2023. I appreciate the chance to visit on this side, and Brad, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Scott, thank you very much for that perspective and for a sort of a global, at least nationwide, recognition of the drivers and the factors going on. We'll see many of those same things happening in Nebraska. Not every statistic is exactly the same. We've sort of have our own unique path that we've gone through as well, but certainly it's going to show up and it's going to look much like a common story. I have the opportunity to talk about a few things here as it relates to Nebraska numbers. And we're going to talk about crop and livestock prices as fundamental drivers of some of the cash receipts and farm income projection. We're going to talk about the farm income safety net. And Scott, as you alluded to already, we see some numbers that are really pretty small right now in terms of potential safety net payments, but there is a role longer run, and a continuing role and a continuing policy question too of what the safety net may look like. That leaves us with maybe a few management tips, or at least a management issues to focus on here for the coming year. So much like talking about the national farm income outlook, if I talk about the Nebraska farm income outlook, there's really two stories here in one graph. The 2024 projection, the last bar on there, is for around a $6 billion net farm income in Nebraska. Compared to 2023, that's down more than $1 billion. Compared to 2021, it's down more than $2 billion. And so it simultaneously looks like a really pretty tough fall from what were record high levels. Nationally, you may remember the statistics noted that farm income went up in 21 to a record and actually went higher in 2022 to a record. In Nebraska, we didn't experience that same 2022 that everybody else did. We had drought losses here that really pulled back on crop production, and that meant lower receipts and lower income in the state. We rebounded in 23 a little bit, while the rest of the country began to pull back. We're all pulling back here, at least projected to do so here in 2024. So farm income is lower, and we're facing with maybe some continued or increasing challenges relative to profitability and cash flow. But compare that to something historically, and it still looks relatively high. It would be the sixth highest farm income on record, if I'm talking in nominal terms here. So it's still relatively strong compared to maybe the last decade. It's just compared to the last 2 to 3 years that it looks like we've made a very dramatic downturn. So let me move that from nominal dollars to real dollars. And if you compare it in real dollars, this is 2024 dollars. So 24 still ends up right at 6 billion. But compare that to our previous record high in 2021. That was in above 9 billion in real terms. But even that doesn't rate to the records that we saw back in 2011 and 2013, where we had close to 10 billion or more as record farm income. So all that to say, we're sort of falling back to earth here. We're not falling necessarily into a hole, but we are certainly falling back from some strong numbers that we've seen the last 2 to 3 years. And that means that we're dealing with maybe reduced revenues and reduced cash flows, even as we still see relatively sticky production costs. Well, let's examine those things a little more specifically. Crop receipts and livestock receipts. Crop receipts have backed up substantially from 2022. They're down into 23. They're down further here in 2024. 2022 looks like crop receipts are up, even though I told you that was a drought year and production was down. Well, there is a difference between crop production value and crop receipts. Crop receipts includes things that are sold as opposed to just things that are produced during the year. So crop receipts benefited in 2022 from 2021 production that was sold at higher prices. When we ended 2022 with less inventory in the bin, that hurt farm income, even if it didn't immediately show up in receipts. That carries over into 23. It's carrying over further into 2024 as we have lower prices on the horizon. Compare that to livestock. Receipts continued dramatically higher from 2020. The rebound and the growth we saw into 21 and then 22 and then 23, that's a straight line heading up. Well, it's backing up in 2024, at least according to our projections. Scott, as you noted, for many commodities, prices have fallen back toward longer run averages, whether we're talking on the pork side or the broiler side or the milk side. For cattle, we're still lingering at and maybe even putting a new peak in for cattle prices, but we're also doing so on reduced marketings. We may appear in 2024 to be turning the corner in terms of bottoming out inventory and beginning to rebuild the herd. Well, as we rebuild the herd, as we retain heifers, we're cutting back even further on marketings, and thus the time when we actually see marketings, the time when we actually see growth in the herd, is actually a time when we end up peaking out on prices as we have the reduced supplies. The likelihood here in 2024, as I said, is relatively stable. It looks like reduced receipts on lower marketings at stable to maybe slightly higher prices. But it also tells us of rounding the bend and moving toward an era of a growing herd, a growing production result, and ultimately softer prices over the longer years. That's the story in terms of receipts. On the other side of the ledger, the story about production expenses in Nebraska is pretty sticky. We found our way to higher production expenses as we had higher incomes. Easy to bid those things into higher production expenses, including all of our inputs as well as our fixed assets like land and machinery and other investments. It's difficult to pull those back, and it's difficult for those markets to respond and pull back to sort of current economics that quickly. The current estimates would suggest that 2024 expenses will fall back slightly from 2023, but I say slightly because if you look at that in any sort of historic fashion, we're still at near record farm expense levels. You've got farm expense levels at 25 to 26 to $27 billion. You had total receipts from crop and livestock a little over 30. That's how tight this has become. It's a tightrope and a relatively thin margin at a much higher level than we've been at before. Well, there is the farm income safety net, and there is an important role for the safety net, an important component to the bottom line for Nebraska producers and for producers across the country. But if you look at that farm income safety net, and I've just got the last 30 years, 35 years or so here charted, what you see in 2022 and 2023 and 2024, even 2021 for that matter, what you see is almost no, or at least negligible crop program payments. Crop program payments are the fundamental support payments for the major program crops as well as for dairy program payments and so forth. They were substantial for decades. They really went downhill in the late 2010s. They have all but disappeared for practical purposes here in the last 3 to 4 years. That's higher prices that translate into lower government payments. This is the projection through 2024. We will see a different number when we look out over the next decade, but it tells us that in the midst of some farm income downturn, some increasingly or still sticky production cost levels, it's not the farm income safety net that's fundamentally going to come in immediately and change the story. For the current production year, the 2024 crop, by the time the 2024-25 marketing year is over next fall, and by the time the crop is harvested this fall, by the time the marketing year is over next fall, if there are any payments, then that comes in late 2025. We will see, or at least it's projected that we'll see some rebound in payments by that point. But in the meantime, there's relatively little cash flow support. Now, I say there are very little or negligible farm program payments here, at least in terms of crop supports. You still see a substantial amount of conservation payments, and those have been relatively steady and steadily growing in the $130 to $150 million a year range. They look like they will grow further over the coming decade. You also see what shows up there in the dark orange or brownish orange bars, supplemental and disaster assistance. There are really sort of 3 big pools that come up here. One of those is standing disaster assistance programs that exist within the Farm Bill, principally for livestock disaster programs. Those are paid out importantly during drought. Those pay out during weather disaster events that affect livestock losses. And so those are an important component of that safety net. There are also the ad hoc emergency payments that have been authorized through congressional action. And we are still rolling out some of those ad hoc programs. We never predict them, until they happen. And then we count how much it amounts to be. Those were substantial back during the COVID years, 2020 and 2021 into 2022. They are still fairly substantial here in terms of a few $100 million of emergency payments expected yet to accrue to Nebraska producers here during the calendar year. There are also the ad hoc programs here that are really of the administration's design. The Secretary of Agriculture has some of that authority to implement programs. And if we back up far enough, in 2018 and 2019, those were trade assistance payments from Secretary Perdue. In the recent years, they have been some climate smart program payments and other support payments from Secretary Vilsack. So there are multiple types of supplemental or disaster assistance programs here, some that are sort of confirmed parts of the ongoing safety net, and some that only show up from time to time. Those have been more substantial than the rest of the safety net put together in recent years. And for the moment, they are still the biggest part of this safety net, except the one that you can't really predict. That's the challenge of how this safety net has worked. Now, one important caveat, and I'll reference it at the end, but crop insurance is also certainly a key part of the safety net. Crop insurance is a substantial federal investment in support for producers. Crop insurance does not show up in this government payment chart. It's not a direct payment to producers. It's a support of a program that is implemented by private insurance providers. So there are billions of dollars of support there nationally. It doesn't show up directly as a direct payment on this chart. Okay. If you put those receipts, the income side, together with the expenses, together with the farm program support or the safety net support that's there, you get the picture of how we have walked from one year to the other. Net farm income in 2022 was around 6.6 billion, down from 2021 because of drought losses and drought concerns. Net farm income in 2023 actually rebounded some. Crop receipts were down, but livestock receipts were up, principally on stronger cattle prices. Production expenses were higher, which pulled down income, and everything else, sort of a multitude of factors in there, led to further adjustments. That gave us our net farm income projection for 2023 of 7.2 billion. Officially, that is still an estimate or a projection. USDA's Economic Research Service will publish official state level numbers later this year in August or early September, but it's an estimate of where we ended up for 2023. Then that story for 2024 is crop receipts are still down. They're down further on continued declines in price expectations. Livestock receipts are now down, as I mentioned. Prices are stable to maybe slightly higher, but marketings are down with the beginnings of rebuilding the herd. Production expenses, they're down slightly, which is why that's a green bar that adds to farm income in this case. It's the marginal effect. They're still high. They're still near record high levels. They're just slightly improved from last year. By the time you add in other changes, we end up at a net farm income projection for 2024 at 6 billion. So it's down, as I noted in the very first chart, it's down substantially from 2023. It's down substantially from 2021. It is still relatively strong in any sort of long-term analysis. And the same way that we have some projections nationally about where we may be going over the next decade, you can begin to draw those pictures here for Nebraska as well. These are projections from our collaboration between the Center for Ag Profitability here at UNL, together with the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center at the University of Missouri. And we rely on their work that builds on the FAPRI work before it. We rely on their work to lead us toward these projections for Nebraska over the next decade. The projections here show the 2024 farm income down around 6 billion. It would show some expected recovery in farm income over the next few years, but still ultimately averaging right around $6 billion. Down from the record, certainly, but still relatively strong compared to maybe the last decade as an example. That's made up of receipts where crop receipts continue their downturn until they roughly level out based on those longer run price projections and year-to-year changes, improvements in productivity. Livestock receipts also look like they will level out, but they level out at relatively strong levels as the cattle herd continues to gradually grow and productivity means total production growing, even as we have some softening in those prices. The farm expense side, unfortunately, sort of looks like a broken record. We hit a record in 23. We backed off of it very slightly in 24, and there's really nothing to suggest substantial changes in that outlook. So we have some revenues that we project out over the decade. We have expenses projected over the decade. We're going to continue to see this challenge of margins and profitability in the coming years. And then farm income projections. 2024 shows up on the chart here with at about about $700 million of farm program payments in Nebraska. We actually stay relatively close to that level over the next decade. Higher here in perhaps 26, 27, and 28 as lower prices, or at least projected lower prices, translate into a rebound of farm program payments. That's the yellow crop program payments there in the graph. But the expected decline of ad hoc disaster and emergency supplemental assistance. There's still some dollars coming through those programs. That's what we would project annually, sort of year in and year out, for livestock disaster assistance, drought, and indemnity losses. But we don't expect ad hoc payments. We never officially expect them until they happen. We could debate whether we expect that to happen from time to time, but we don't fundamentally project that those things will be there. So ad hoc support, that additional support that we've really had strong cash flow on for the last 5 to 7 years, looks like it gradually disappears or rather quickly disappears in the coming years. Commodity program payments come back and ultimately sort of balance out the portfolio for the time being. But we're certainly looking at safety net levels, farm program payment levels that are modest compared to the records that we saw back in 2019, 2020, 2021, and some of the years prior. That sort of gives us a story, at least here in Nebraska, and I think maybe a broader implication for producers across the country. But recognizing that we do have some new challenges here in 2024. With crop and livestock production, lower crop prices mean receipts fall back, cash flow falls back, margins get tighter. Livestock receipts pull back a little bit in 24 based on the decline in marketings. With some herd regrowth and relatively stable prices, we may see that rebound in the coming years, but for the moment, that means lower receipts for producers. You could add that into the production expenses that I highlight down there at the bottom. Production expenses pull back from record. Congratulations. Yes, but they stay pretty sticky, pretty close to that record. And those are going to be challenges that we deal with for the next decade. The safety net, as I mentioned, for the moment, the commodity program is really minimal. We are at the moment debating a new farm bill, or at least we're sort of anticipating action in Congress to really debate a new farm bill. And that might include some debate about the size or the level of the safety net. As it currently sits, that safety net isn't offering much in terms of expected protection or in terms of expected payments. It offers protection right now, whether you're enrolled in ARC or PLC. It offers protection that might kick in with a 5 to 10 to 15% drop in prices or revenues. It doesn't offer protection at expected levels, but it might offer some downside protection that we don't budget right here. Right now, with sort of the minimal impact of commodity programs, it really is about insurance. And we've seen the strong support for crop insurance programs and the big part that plays in providing a safety net for producers. Increasingly, that's happening on the livestock side as well, with substantial growth in the livestock risk protection program and the other livestock relevant insurance products, LRP, LGM, DRP on the dairy side, or PRF, pasture range and forage, for those forage losses on the livestock side as well. Those are increasingly important to producers, and those do add more safety in that analysis. But recognize that we're dependent upon a safety net that for the moment looks like it might have limited cash flow. That puts the burden back on management. How do you manage in lieu of those maybe lower receipts and lesser government protection? It's about management efficiency and cost control. Production expenses look slightly better, but still relatively sticky, and still a challenge for producers to address. If you try and boil all that down to a bottom line, the single biggest factor in 2024, and maybe every year, is margin. It's not exactly yield, it's not exactly price or revenue, it's margin. And that's the challenge that we have in Nebraska. That's the challenge that we'll have across the country here as a whole. So that's really a perspective about Nebraska to complement what we see in the national picture. Scott, I'll invite you to come back live with us as well and deal with some questions here. We didn't mention in the beginning, but if you notice the chat box, there's a chat box, there's a Q&A box. If you open up either of those, you can certainly ask questions and engage in some discussion here about where we're heading with farm income projections nationally as well as here in Nebraska. But Scott, I want to pose one of these questions first to you. The importance of the safety net, and right now in the midst of a farm bill debate that may or may not adjust the safety net going forward. Can you describe again, you mentioned that the FAPRI number looks amazingly stable, or at least nice and smooth. And yet that's because it's really an average of a simulation of many potential outcomes. Can you sort of explain again how much variability might be embedded behind those numbers and what that means in terms of the role of the safety net?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think way too often we look at those averages and we go, oh, no variability after coming off of immense volatility. And I'll say, I just take this year in particular. If we have really good yields and we put record crops in the bin this fall, I think we get lower corn and soybean prices. But if we have very dry weather, I think those corn and soybean prices go higher. So there's a lot of uncertainty, all depending on crop size at the end of the day. And so I think your point about risk management's really good, especially as we talk farm bill, as we talk about other risk management. And I don't care what commodity, more volatility ahead, not less volatility for prices. And I think it's imperative to do more risk management than maybe we have in the past. That probably doesn't mean you hit home runs, but maybe it's singles and doubles that will serve well, given what I think will be a lot of volatility. We're sitting here with, I think, some weather concerns in some parts of the country. We're a far cry from when we really need rain, but weather seems to have been more variable of late. If you look at the corn prices that I showed in that FAPRI graph, there was a $3 corn price. Now, do I expect corn prices to average $3? No, I don't. But you put a bunch of really good back-to-back yield years together, and you're going to get prices in the $3 range. At the same time, a tight year or two, and you're back at $6. I think that's what we have to get used to, Brad.
You bet. Scott, I would second that. We've done a fair amount of farm bill education in the last 2 months here. Even though it was the same basic ARC versus PLC decision again as it has been in previous years, we did some education because of the sort of the changing economics. And I think one could say that some producers probably came to that decision this year and said, does it really matter? Because it hasn't paid much in the last 2 to 3 years. How much does this decision really matter? This, unfortunately, this may be the year that it really matters. And that safety net doesn't look like it pays, but it's not that far out of the money in terms of when it might have to help provide some support for producers. So, Scott, I want to carry on another question that came up here early, and we get to it now. But basically, is asking producers, we have these farm income projections, and it sort of represents the aggregate, which can be divided and mean the average, but that doesn't tell us about sort of different types of producers or different financial positions. We're talking about a farm income projection that falls roughly 25% in Nebraska compared to where it was at record levels in 21. We're talking about nationally even a greater drop than that. Well, in Nebraska, if I use a number, record farm income in 21, we had counted it right around 8 billion. Farm income projection for 2024 is at 6 billion. That's a drop of 25%, $2 billion. Interest paid in Nebraska is around 1.5 billion. In other words, interest is a really, really pretty big chunk of what producers pay, and it rivals the total profitability margin in there for some producers. It's up dramatically. It's up 10 to 15 or 10 to 20% here in Nebraska. But then some producers are also working without any debt on their balance sheet. What does their profitability outlook look like compared to those who are leveraged, and sort of what challenges do we see of dealing with leverage and cash flow needs as we have this outlook now?
Yeah, so it is a good question, and I do think it's a combination of financial position and commodity mix on those operations that are important to the discussion. I will say, I think, you and I both allude to just the record levels of farm income that occurred a couple of years ago. I think equity positions got much, much better generally for many producers, and cash positions got better for many producers. And I think that's a little bit of how we can better handle what's now lower incomes. I guess I'm not ready to say those with no debt are going to be really profitable. I just think it's easier for them to manage if they're really setting their debt free, and the decisions they have in front of them, maybe they do less risk management, Brad. Because they can absorb some downside, whereas someone highly leveraged, I think this is where the risk management is much more important. The edge of the cliff is a lot closer for them, and I think that's the piece of the puzzle that's important for individual producers to think through. What's their situation? I will say, I think there's a reason why we haven't seen land values and cash rents move down too much at this point. It's what's been a nice change in equity position that I think we're still maybe in some ways running through some of that equity gain in terms of what's being paid for land and what's being paid for cash rents at this point. That could change or at least soften. I'm not going to suggest a big downturn anytime soon, because if we stay where we're at, right, so here to me is the crux of all this outlook. We stay where we're at, it's kind of flat to sideways. But if those expenses go up more than we anticipate, or we lose more on the revenue side than we think, it doesn't take a much larger move, I think, to get us in a more serious financial situation. And that's what we want to avoid and do the risk management for.
So, Scott, that really bridges to another question that came up here, which fundamentally asks the relevant question. If farm incomes are backing up as sharply as they have now for the past 2 years, why are land prices and cash rents still up? And why are they so strong? So you just described it's we're backing up sharply, but we also are backing up from record levels, which means that we still look pretty strong financially. So, and crystal ball here on land markets, Scott, since you can, tell us what to invest in, but the last 2 years downturn sort of brings us back to more longer run levels. That's not enough to by itself necessarily to kill any sort of hope for land markets and cash rents. But you just described we're also much closer to the margin, which means maybe there's more reality coming, or at least there's more risk of a reality check here that could impact land in the coming years.
Yeah, so Brad, recently I was looking at some individual county level data related to a debt on farmland, and I was surprised to find that data suggesting roughly plus or minus 10%. 20% of the land in a county had debt against it, which was lower than I anticipated, but I think just highlights what's been a much better equity position that the last few years have allowed. And I think it just means it's easier to weather the storm. And some may say, well, those land values never return what is being paid for the land today. And I'll just say, if I'm going to pay cash for that, it may not have been the best investment. I sometimes say, maybe I should have went and bought the car wash in town. But it's not like it's going to get someone in a financial tough situation likely. And so I think that's a little bit of what's at play, is just we're coming into what's a tighter period with just a much better financial situation.
Yep. Okay, some questions about economic outlook at the moment. Interest rates. Are we headed for lower interest rates this year? Will we see that in terms of relief on interest costs, and how many cuts and how quickly?
We've asked this question of all the economists, and although economists tend to be pretty pessimistic generally, I think we've become more pessimistic as that question's been posed to us more often. I know Brad's been a part of that as well. To me right now, when I look at the situation, it seems like we're not going to see a major cut in interest rates that are helpful in 2024. I still hold out hope we'll start to see some cuts in late 2024 that helps us for operating loans in 2025. But just given where inflation signals have been of late and the Fed's response to that data, it just seems like to me that we're further away from interest rate cuts. Could we get a half a percentage cut in 2024? I still hold out hope, but gone is the let's get a full percentage point cut. Now that I've said that out loud, I hope that we get a full point cut coming really quickly, Brad.
That would be one of those shocks that would end up with a rather substantial bump in the pathway. How about another shock that could dramatically change the pathway? And that it's in the area of biofuels, and particularly sustainable aviation fuel as the new panacea or the new market that arguably has potential to swallow up a dramatic share of production if only it comes to fruition. What do you see on it? I've got some perspectives I've gathered from watching and listening to experts as well. What do you see on it?
So I think there's some good long-term opportunity for growth there. And I think to SAF in particular and ethanol in particular, or corn in particular, there could be some opportunity. I think it takes a longer period of time. This is not a 2024, 2025 kind of help, but maybe long-term, it's what corn markets need, because we need demand to grow on the corn side in particular. It seems to me it's hard to kind of find the next big growth area. So SAF might be one of the things that solves that. I think we still have to figure out exactly what kind of credit we get on that side. Modeling efforts ongoing. But just to say, let's put it in the decade-long discussion, not the next year or two discussion. is the important piece of that. And I'll let you fill in the rest of the story.
Yeah, well, I watch it, on the policy side, and it is as complex a policy market as one could imagine. Now, I'm saying that to someone, Scott, who has a better understanding of dairy policy than almost anybody in the country, and we typically say dairy policy is so complex that we can't explain it. Well, biofuels policy seems to kind of look like that at times. But we're seeing sustainable aviation fuel. We're seeing that market as a potential. That's a growth area, even as we're concerned that motor vehicle fuel usage may be topping out, and the role for ethanol in that market is maybe hit a peak, barring any sort of higher blend rates. So there's a lot of promise, a lot of hope put on sustainable aviation fuel. It still gets driven by policy. It's driven by the tax credit that's a function of the reduction in emissions, or it's driven by policy mandates about how much needs to come from sustainable sources. And for ethanol to play a role, for this to become a big ethanol driver, it seems like there are three big policy questions, maybe four, that haven't been resolved. One is the size of the tax credit and maybe the sustainability of that over time. Two is emissions and whether it qualifies or whether it doesn't qualify for the market and for different levels. There are, from watching experts, and I think of the work that Scott Irwin has done at the University of Illinois and others talking about emissions in the sustainable aviation fuel in the corn ethanol pathway. There are emissions of corn production. The modeling that's currently being done by EPA suggests that maybe certain environmental practices like conservation tillage or cover crops or nutrient management have to improve for that emissions number to improve on the production side. There are emissions at the processing level. And how do you reduce emissions at the processing level? Well, you capture carbon. Right now, our announced plan to capture carbon is to capture it at the plant and pipe it to an underground reservoir that demands a pipeline. That is not everybody's favorite strategy. And so we've got issues of even if we know how to do it, that may not be as easy as it seems. And then the third major category of emissions is indirect land use. And that's sort of this conceptual model of, we know there are impacts on supply and demand from moving this commodity from a food and feed market to a fuel market. And we know that has impacts, but calculating exactly how big that is a rather difficult prospect. And trying to debate the merits of indirect land use for Midwestern corn that goes to ethanol, that goes to California, versus Brazilian sugarcane that goes to, or even Brazilian corn that goes to ethanol, that goes to California, is a really complicated and somewhat messy and maybe somewhat inconsistent sort of calculation at the moment. Lots of policy issues that we've got to resolve before we really can confidently project, I think, where sustainable aviation fuel could go. Okay. That's a policy economist talking about a market perspective, so let's stop it at that. Scott, I do have one question, knowing that we've hit our time, but I've got one question that fundamentally you can wrap up here better, and it's a couple of them together. This is collaborative work that RAF does with the Center for Ag Profitability here at Nebraska to produce a Nebraska report. I know you also collaborate with other states and you produce farm income projections in other states. And the question really is twofold. What do those other states tell us? And is the Nebraska trend more generally happening across the country, or are there some unique differences that we should know about?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll say we do see a lot of variability, and it's not the same everywhere across the country. I think all you have to do is look at the mix of commodities in these individual states. And I'll tend to say the states that are more crop driven right now are the ones that were actually showing expected larger declines in farm income. A state that we're just starting to work in, Illinois, we're suggesting more like a 30% decline. And I think that has a lot to do with the much more focus on crops and a little less on the livestock side. States like Nebraska, Missouri, Kansas, yes, crops are critically important, but we also are now seeing some savings on the feed cost side. So there's
Right.
the commodity mix, I think, that's really important. In fact, one of our collaborating states, Kansas, we might talk about slight uptick in farm income in 2024, driven very much by cattle. So there isn't a one answer really fits all. And I think, Brad, that's why we've been focused on, let's take the national work that FAPRI's done for decades and start to look at these kind of individual states and begin to look at what kind of policy do we need to affect different states. So what's unique about Nebraska? What's unique about Missouri? I think those are the important things that this collaboration is beginning to allow us to discuss.
Well, Scott, thank you for that. You're right. Every state is unique. Being a diversified crop and livestock state like we are in Nebraska means that sometimes we weather through these cycles better. And that's exactly why this analysis at a state to state level really adds to it. That's a reminder how much we appreciate the collaboration, the ongoing collaboration that we have between Nebraska and Missouri, between the Center for Ag Profitability and the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center. Scott, thank you for your time today, and thank you for your leadership on this collaboration over the long run. We look forward to the next go-round and the next cycle and continued discussion and work with RAF. So I turn to you as the audience and thank you as well for your participation today. Thanks for sticking with us a few minutes past the lunch hour here, Central Time, but an opportunity to address some important questions and issues and provide as best we can a perspective on where we're at and where we're going here in terms of the farm economy. So I thank you for joining us. Of course, as always, a recording of this webinar will be posted on our webpage. So if you're coming back and want to find a particular discussion or a particular slide, you'll be able to find it on the recording. The slides will be posted there as well, along with the recording, so you can find that information on the website. That's cap.unl.edu. That's the general website. The webinars are /webinars, simple enough. And you'll find that information. You'll find information on our upcoming webinars and an opportunity to register and join those in the coming weeks as well. So as you leave, we will appreciate your feedback. You'll get a brief evaluation that pops up as you close your Zoom window. We greatly appreciate your feedback that you provide to tell us how today went, as well as tell us what we should be doing and what we could cover in the future. So with that, again, Scott, thank you for your time. Thank you for the continued collaboration, and we wish everyone a great day.